This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, President Biden announced his support for several major Supreme Court reforms, including 18-year term limits and a binding code of ethics for the justices. So let's say Democrats control Congress next year. They control the White House. They introduce legislation to impose term limits on the Supreme Court. Can the Supreme Court itself then strike down that law?
Yeah. So first of all, kudos to the president for proposing this. You know, this is exactly what we need. And we need this going into an election, right? Because we need the American people to understand that the issues involving the Supreme Court are real. They are real for not just the legal system, but they are real in the lives of Americans. And so I am thrilled to see that President Biden put this on the agenda. Now, that said, you know, Brian, it is a commentary on where the Supreme Court is at and how we all view the Supreme Court, that the first question we ask is, if there is Supreme Court review, will they step forward and essentially nullify Supreme Court review? So, Look, I think that's a legitimate question. I think it's terrible that we have to ask it, but it's a legitimate question. I don't think that there is a legitimate way for the Supreme Court to strike down laws that Congress makes, because Congress is allowed to define a lot of things about the Supreme Court, right? Like the Constitution says that there will be a Chief Justice and lower court judges and other judges as Congress specifies. And so what the president is proposing are common sense measures that are well within Congress's authority. But I'm going to be the first one to be right along with you and say that, you know, if Congress does this, we got to watch the justices, because they've done a lot of things that seem to be more about protecting the court than about protecting the people.
Well, that raises the obvious question: how do you get around the issue of a self-policing Supreme Court that disallows any check on its own power? Like, if they can strike down legislation policing themselves, then doesn't that create like some sort of constitutional crisis?
Yeah, so, you know, it's a really smart question, because the whole notion of the court in our three branches of government, it was set up to be actually the least powerful branch, right? The most powerful branch was Congress, right? Because it had the ability to declare war, it had the ability to raise and spend money. It was seen, and it was the originator of all laws, so it was seen as the most powerful branch, followed by the executive branch. But the courts were always viewed as the least powerful branch, because their power was simply to review legislation and interpret it, review it for consistency with the Constitution, and interpret it. And they didn't have the power to enforce it. They didn't have the power to raise money. And yet, in the last few years, it feels like this is all flipped on its head. I mean, you know, the notion that the Supreme Court would somehow strike down rules that apply to it would have been a foreign discussion even a decade ago. That would have been something that just would have seemed like implausible. But I think that the Supreme Court has brought a lot of power onto itself. But I have to believe that at the end of the day, the court would understand the absolute disaster it would visit upon its own legitimacy if it struck down reform, for example, on its ethics.
You got Clarence Thomas out there somewhere smoking a cigarette saying, "Try me. Challenge accepted."
Right. Is there a flag flying when he's doing that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Just hoisting up his appeal to heaven flag saying, "Try me. Let's go." Mark, same question here. What about an enforceable code of ethics? Can the Supreme Court itself strike down the prospect of a code of ethics on the Supreme Court?
I find this to be the most bizarre part of this whole conversation, because there is a code of ethics that applies to the executive branch. There's a code of ethics that applies to members of Congress. And by the way, members of Congress are directly mentioned in the Constitution, right? Like the legislative branch, Congress, is like spelled out with a lot of powers, but they're by statute, they have put in place various laws that govern their behavior, including various rules about gifts, what employment they can have, you know, what outside conflicts they can have. Same with the executive branch. So there should not be any debate and of course the judicial branch has a code of conduct that applies to lower judges. So there should be no serious question as to whether or not it can apply to the Supreme Court. And again, I think that the Supreme Court justices are doing themselves an enormous disservice to the extent they are leaving open the suggestion that somehow they are above the law. Their legitimacy literally hangs in the balance.
Biden also called for a constitutional amendment that would effectively overturn their presidential immunity decision. The threshold for that is prohibitively high. It's 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of all states. Why the constitutional amendment as opposed to law, given that higher bar to pass anything?
So the reason why I think the reason why that is proposed as a constitutional amendment is because the idea is they have to overturn a ruling of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court would say is applying the Constitution. So you can't, if the Constitution says he has immunity, you can't really pass a law that says he doesn't have immunity because the Constitution itself trumps a law. Okay, so that literally and figuratively. The only reason why I'm not as pessimistic as you are is the following. I think Donald Trump's going to lose this fall. I think Kamala Harris is going to be the 47th president of the United States. And when that happens, the Republicans are going to face the following reality. Number one, it's possible that at long last, the hold that this petty dictator wannabe, Donald Trump, that it finally breaks. And that Republicans are like, you know what, we have hitched our wagon to this guy and all we have done is lost and lost and lost. And so they may not be so enamored by him. But number two, they're going to face the practical reality that the person who will benefit from this absolute immunity is not Donald Trump, but is now another Democratic president. So maybe common sense enters their brain and they say, you know what? Why are we shilling for the former failed president? Why shouldn't we worry about the future, since politics is usually about the future, not the past? And so maybe they actually agree to pass 2/3 out of Congress and 3/4 of the states. I know what you're going to say. The fever didn't break after 2020. Why would it break after 2024?
Yep. I'm just waiting. I'm waiting. The words are jumping out of my mouth. My very cynical pushback to that would be that because there is an asymmetry at play here where Democrats don't wield that kind of power, Republicans would basically say, look, allow this ruling to stand, knowing full well that Kamala Harris wouldn't avail herself of it, but at least it preserves that power for the next Republican president who, in fact, would be content to wield that power when they got into office.
Yeah, and I think that you're exactly right. We've talked about this before. There is an asymmetry between the two parties. I wrote a piece for Democracy Docket about this, about election denialism. Let's be clear, there's an asymmetrical relationship between the two parties when it comes to voter suppression and election denialism. Like, Democrats do not engage in voter suppression, and we do not engage in election denialism. And so the fact that Donald Trump has enablers that are doing those things puts him at an advantage. And I agree with you with respect to this. I mean, like, President Biden, one of the questions you and I both got a lot of, because we joked about this, after the Supreme Court is, well, why doesn't Joe Biden do these things that the Supreme Court says he can do? And the answer is because Joe Biden's a decent man. Joe Biden reveres the Constitution. He cherishes his oath of office. So he's not going to do those things. And of course, that is true for Kamala Harris. It's true for other Democrats. And you're right, Republicans hope that that's not the case for Republican presidents. But that asymmetry can only survive in a democratic system for so long. We have to hope that eventually Republicans lose that willingness, that shamelessness, and their willingness to do anything.
Well, is there anything that Kamala Harris could do that would preserve decency and preserve the institutions of government that would be enough still to show Republicans that this shouldn't be in effect? Like, do you know what I'm trying to? What I'm trying to ask here? Basically, if we want this to go away, she has to give them some reason for this to go away that would disadvantage Republicans, but would still, but we don't want to succumb to the same levels of lawlessness that are the reason we don't want this there in the first place.
Look, I think the only way that the Republican Party is going to be redeemed and become a responsible part of the American political system is humiliating defeat. I don't think there's anything Kamala Harris can do as president. I don't think there's anything Joe Biden can do as president. Joe Biden has governed as the most decent, bipartisan person we have seen in that office for a very long time. I mean, George Bush II ran on this idea of restoring dignity and honor to the Oval Office. If you wanted a president to restore dignity and honor to the Oval Office, it was Joe Biden, right? I mean, he has genuinely tried to meet Republicans more than halfway on almost everything. Totally. And yet, here they are renominating Donald Trump. The only way this is going to break and change is if Republicans go to stinging defeat after stinging defeat after stinging defeat. And then, frankly, their self-interest will force them to change.
Right. I think that's perfectly put. Well, for those watching right now, to support the work that Marc and his team are doing to make sure to protect democracy in ground zero, which is the courts, please make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the free news outlet he founded to focus on everything voting in elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Very small step you can take to support a great team that's doing invaluable work. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.